Modern civilization has afforded us the departure from our nature. Our ancestors tracked their food, hunted it, ended life to sustain life. It was nature. Now, while many folks still hunt for food, most of us take what we need from a grocery store shelf. For those who venture into the wilderness to re-enter the food chain, they are sometimes reminded of the true terror that is nature, and of the things that lie just beyond nature's patterned and sensible walls. Beyond that is madness. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories about horrifying things seen while hunting. Send your stories to us at darkstories.org. And follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Thank you. Now, let us begin. Warning: the following story contains visceral depictions of animals fighting for survival. Battle of the Backwoods. From Anonymous. Nothing haunts a man more than the decisions of the past. The world threw something impossible for me to comprehend at an early age. I would soon find out that life is not all rainbows and cotton candy. Many people come here and see the majestic mist rising from the mountains early in the morning and think of it as pure beauty. However, all I see is gases the hills belch up from whatever they swallowed up the night before. Because for me, the mountains have tainted my very soul and left holes in my heart forever. The wilderness can grant many gifts: growth, new life, clarity, and a vast amount of opportunities. But also the wild can suffocate you in sorrow and drown you in dread, given the right circumstances. Have you ever asked yourself what you would do in the event of needing a helping hand in a dire situation? This was the difficulty that I was faced with, which changed my life forever. I grew up in the foothills of eastern Kentucky, what I consider to be the base of the Appalachian Mountains, on my grandparents' farm, mostly. I spent the majority of my childhood learning lessons of life with my grandfather. The value of $1 was also how I had my fun digging ginseng roots, hunting for substance, and wildlife population management in our area. My grandfather was a fur bearer like his father before him. Anything that was hard work pretty much is part of my upbringing. Looking back on those years, I would not trade them for anything. We went to church every Wednesday and Sunday, and always had a lot of cousins around to play within the creeks and streams around the farm. Taught early survival in the wilderness, I learned lessons that never came easy, but always held lasting impressions. We only went to town a couple of days a week when we visited the feed store for our livestock, and sometimes I would rent a movie from the video store uptown. That was as close as I got to the big city lifestyle as a child. The main thing we did most nights when the whippoorwills started singing and the lightning bugs came out was to gather our hound dogs and travel to the Daniel Boone National Forest to go raccoon hunting. We did this because, as I said, my grandfather and I were fur bearers. The raccoon population in our area is very thick, so this was part of our lifestyle to chase that hard-earned dollar. Also for wildlife management population control, because raccoons can carry and transmit more types of diseases than most animals in our area. We had 2 dogs at that time. Our young dog's name was Bo. He was a red tick hound, beautiful in every way. He was mostly red in color with a few white specks on him, almost the color of strawberry wine. Our older dog was a treeing Walker hound. Around here we just call his breed Walker, and his name was Old Jake. He was a giant of a dog for his breed, at somewhere around 120 pounds. He was a tricolored dog, meaning he was black, white, and tan. He was an absolutely great hound, and had a heck of a good nose on him for tracking critters through the mountains of the Daniel Boone National Forest. Old Jake wasn't afraid of anything at all. Once he would track a raccoon to a tree, it was his domain. On this particular night, it was the opening night of raccoon hunting season in the state of Kentucky, October 1st, 2003. My grandfather and I had decided to go on a hunting adventure into the Daniel Boone National Forest. He was in poor health, so I always had to handle our dogs and take care of them when we went out on our nightly hunts. We had a bit of a late start that evening, so we had to travel off of the beaten path on a 6-mile road called Shooting Range Road near the Clear Creek and Leatherwood area of the Daniel Boone. Once we got to the very end of the road and it came to a dead end, we parked our truck. We then got out, dropped the tailgate down, and opened up the dog box door. Bo and old Jake jumped to the ground, ran straight down a creek in the forest, and started hunting for a raccoon scent. A short while after, old Jake started barking on the scent track he smelled, and then Bo joined in with him, making that sweet southern hound music that whistled a gravely song through the crisp night air. They tracked the scent of the raccoon they were chasing up the side of a mountain and over a cliff a good 700 yards away from the truck. Shortly after that, the raccoon got tired of running and decided to climb a tree. Both the dogs let out what is called a location bark, letting us know that they found the animal location they had been chasing and will continue to bark until I get to the tree they're at. That's just how they're trained. My grandfather looked at me and said,
"Sounds to me they found it. Go on, grab the gun out of the truck and take the two-way radio with you so we can keep in touch."
As I said before, my grandfather was in poor health. He could not travel on foot very far. So I did just as he said, strapping the gun to my back, grabbing the two-way radio, and starting into the forest towards the location of our dogs. As I made my way in, I heard the sound of a pack of coyotes off in the distance, barking and howling, going on crazy as a coyote pack does. Grandfather called me on the radio, saying,
"Do you hear that pack of coyotes? You better get in there quick to the dogs. That way when they see you, they'll run away."
I know that might sound crazy to a lot of people, but in our area of Kentucky, coyotes are hunted hard because they can cause harm to livestock, so they're mostly nocturnal in our area and are terrified of people. In almost every case when a coyote sees a human, they run as fast as they can to get away from them, at least in Kentucky. After that, I started picking up my pace, trying to get to our hounds. However, it was too late. Just minutes later, the pack of coyotes had made it to our hounds, and within seconds, a massive fight broke out. I heard them grab a hold of Bo. He began to whimper and took off running to get away from them. But not old Jake. He held his ground right next to the tree he tracked the raccoon to. In his mind, he probably thought the coyotes were coming to take the tree away from him, but really they just wanted to eat him. Old Jake fought all over the place with the pack of coyotes. He was holding his ground for a while. Soon after, the whole dynamic of the struggle changed, and the coyotes were starting to fight old Jake as a pack. My grandfather called me again.
"Get in there quick. They're gonna kill him."
So I started running through the forest, scared for my dog's life. Suddenly, again, the fight changed, and Bo had circled back around and came back to help old Jake fight the pack of coyotes. Once again, old Jake was holding his ground, or so I thought. The coyotes were whimpering and screaming. It was just pure mayhem in the woods, an absolute battle. I soon made it to old Jake, and once I shined my flashlight on him, I saw that he had a coyote by the throat. Once he saw me, old Jake let go. That coyote took off running along with the rest of the pack. I walked over to old Jake, bent over and patted him on the head, checking him out. There were a few cuts and gashes on him. Overall, he was in good shape, being that he was just in a fight with a pack of coyotes and lived. Just in front of us was a huge black oak tree, and behind it, I heard the sound of a coyote whimpering, doing what I would call a blood gargle, choking on its own blood. Old Jake and I walked around to check it out. I was thinking that around this tree, we'd see that Bo had killed a coyote. But once we could see, I then noticed that it wasn't Bo. It wasn't Bo at all. It was a great big dog, very broad, bigger than the size of a Saint Bernard. It turns and looks at me while holding a dead coyote in its mouth by the ribcage. No part of the dead coyote was touching the ground. I stopped. The strange dog dropped the coyote out of its mouth and looked at me. That's when I realized how much I underestimated the massive size of this animal. It leaned forward and stood up on its hind legs in a really slow motion that I can only compare to an elderly person trying to get out of a rocking chair. At this moment, I thought it was leaning against something. That was the only logical explanation. This thing then took 2 steps forward while standing on 2 legs. I then noticed the chest. It didn't have a dog's chest. It had the chest of a man's abdomen too. Then the hands caught my attention. It was moving them up beside itself, and the hands were more similar to that of a man, but more like claws. I saw its face was charcoal-colored, with solid black eyes of eternal darkness, with blood coating dripping down its mouth to its chest, like hot candle wax running down a wick. So much blood, not like the blood you would normally see in any type of animal fight. It was more so like it was eating the coyote alive during the previous attack, before my arrival. Again, the creature took another step towards me. I broke out into a cold sweat, my mind finally realizing what I was looking at was a darn werewolf. That is not supposed to be of this world. The feeling in my mind was just absolute horror, as if the world around me no longer existed. I was immersed in some sort of overwhelming sense of dread. In a millisecond, my fight or flight emotion kicked in. I jumped back and started to run. I shone my flashlight forward as I ran, and then back behind me, over and over to see what was happening. During this time, the sounds of my oversized gumboots were clicking loudly in the stillness of the night, and the crunching of the dead leaves beneath each stride that I took. The creature then began to chase after me, moving at a pace I'd never seen. Soon after the monster took only a few steps, old Jake hit into him, lunging his body weight towards the dogman-type creature that made a loud thud noise of old Jake's body slamming into the monster. Old Jake snapped his jaws together, growling, trying to protect me from any harm. As I shined my light behind me, the werewolf just pushed old Jake off of him with one hand like he was just a gnat, a fly, a flea, like he was nothing and it didn't bother the creature at all, while old Jake rolled back onto the ground 4 or 5 feet. Then the creature continued to chase me, like I was the only thing in the world it was interested in. I started to yell out, "Put it to him, Jake! Put it to him! Come on! You can do it!" All the while I continued to run for my life, my gun still strapped to my back. It was only a .22 caliber rifle. That wouldn't cause any harm to this creature, other than maybe aggravate it even more. I stood at 5'10", and this creature towered over me at least another 2 feet in height. As I'm running, once again old Jake attempts to stop him as it chases me, throwing his own body weight into the monster, and like the first time it pushes him aside with ease. So back to the chase. The werewolf went in my direction as I ran. It had its mind set on me and me alone. I'm running with everything I had, all the energy my legs could produce, through the forest, towards the direction of the truck. I tried screaming again. "Come on, old Jake! Put it to him! Get him, Jake! Get him! Come on, Jake, I need you!" Yet this thing was gaining ground on me quickly. For the 3rd time, old Jake comes in towards the monster and hits him again with his body weight. This time, I heard a loud popping noise. Sounded like the jaws of death locking down on the creature. Before I turned around, I just knew that old Jake had finally made good contact with the monster. That's when I saw Jake had his mouth latched onto the hip of the werewolf, just hanging onto there like a chihuahua on a mailman. That was essentially the size difference. Old Jake just wasn't anywhere near the same size as this animal. The monster then stopped and grabbed old Jake with both of its hands, and as sure as I'm telling you this story now, it threw old Jake through the woods like a bag of garbage. I could see old Jake's body flying through the air, hitting low-hanging tree branches, leaves, and brush. I knew at that point old Jake was dead. It was just me and the monster at this moment. I continued to run, tears now rolling down my face, a sense of both sorrow and dread with the thoughts in my mind that this thing just killed my dog. I'm all alone. No one here to save me, not even Daniel Boone himself can come up from the grave and help me at this point. I'm a goner, for sure. The monster continued to run after me. It was so close to me that I could feel the heat on the back of my neck. I'm trying to run in a zigzag type of movement. While being overwhelmed with emotion, I started yelling once again. "Come on, old Jake, please. I need you." But no matter how many times I yelled and screamed for help, none came. Old Jake was gone. I stumbled over a fallen tree branch and fell face down on my belly into an old treetop that had blown over in the forest, maybe after a storm or something. I rolled over on my back, and the creature dropped down on all 4 feet. I started to crawl back into the mangled tree branches and decaying leaves, while the monster continued to pursue me. By then, the animal and I were at point-blank range, just a couple of feet from each other. It snapped its mouth and snarled, blood from the freshly killed coyote still dripping down its mouth, mixed with snot and drool while blowing its breath right on me, the smell of rot and decay coming with it. The whole time, I continued to yell, "Come on, Jake, come on!" But I knew that was it. This was the end, and I was trying to crawl for my life backward while facing the animal, just trying to find a way out. As the creature was now in range to grab a hold of me, out of nowhere, old Jake hits the monster broadside, throwing himself into it, and it rolls over onto its back. Jake climbs up on top of it and starts mauling him, snapping his jaws, just munching on the beast. Old Jake was really putting the hurt to this dog from hell. I heard Jake's jaws lock down someplace on the creature and the sounds of bones crushing. The monster let out a painful howl that felt as if it rattled the very earth I was crawling on. I realized this was my chance. I stood up and ran across the mountain once again. The whole time I could hear the battle that was taking place behind me, and I was no longer looking back. Unfortunately, the situation changed, and I could hear the monster finally turn back on old Jake. It sounded like it was ripping him apart. He was letting out painful barks and whimpers, making my stomach turn into knots hearing the pain old Jake was going through. At this time, I came upon a clearing not far from the truck, and I turned around, took the rifle off my back, and began to fire. The gunshots echoed off the mountains around me. I began to yell, "Come on, Jake, let's go!" But the forest had gone completely silent, and it seemed no noise at all could be heard. I ran down to the truck, opening the door and climbing inside. My grandfather said,
"What on earth is going on?"
I said to him, "Just drive. We have to go. We need to get out of here." I started to tell him what happened, every detail I could. I was trembling in pure terror. Calmly, my grandfather said,
"Listen, if you want to hunt, fish, and do stuff as a man, then you need to realize that there are things in the woods that I cannot explain, and you have to come to terms with that if you want to continue to live this lifestyle."
In his humbling words, he then said,
"Since you are so upset, I'll go ahead and take you home, but we will come back in the morning to look for Bo and old Jake."
I said to him, "No point in coming back. I heard what happened to old Jake. He's dead. Papa, he's gone. He fought for my life, but he just didn't make it." Once again, my grandfather spoke.
"If everything you said is true, then you owe it to old Jake to at least come back in the morning and look for him. He fought tooth and nail for your life."
As a boy of just 15 years old, what my grandfather said was both the law and the truth to me. Every single word was one of wisdom and knowledge, well beyond my years. We drove home, and I didn't sleep very much at all the rest of the night, knowing as soon as day broke, we were going to drive back out to that area to look for the hounds, meanwhile still being filled with mixed emotions about the event that happened just hours before. I felt everything from fear to heartbreak, an absolutely traumatic event. But as the morning came and the fog was lifted from the mountains, we loaded up in the truck and traveled back out to the location we had been hunting the night before. My grandfather got out of the truck, and I just rolled my window down. We both began to call for the dogs. "Here, Jake! Here! Let's go home!" We yelled for Bo too, but he had run far away when the coyotes had bitten him, so at the time I wasn't that worried about him. We would drive up and down the gravel road, repeating the same actions time and time again with no luck. So my grandfather said we would go home and return that evening to try once again. So that evening when we drove back to where we last saw our hounds, we started to call and whistle for them again. On down the road a bit, we could hear something moving through the forest coming out towards the road, and once it stepped out, my grandfather said,
"Hey, Bo just came out of the woods, that big red tick dog of yours. So grab your dog leash and go get him."
I said, "All right, Papa." I started to walk towards Bo. He was just barely moving slowly, and as I got closer to him, I realized that wasn't Bo. It was old Jake, covered from head to toenail in blood, some dry, most still moist. His injuries were beyond severe. Anyone who would have seen him at the time would have questioned how he was even standing, with a couple of broken bones and major flesh wounds across his body, but he was still alive. My grandfather walked over and grabbed all 120 pounds of old Jake's mangled body. He picked him up and carried him over to the vehicle, putting him in the back of the truck. I had never seen my grandfather do something like that. He was a tough love type of guy, but he was just as heartbroken at that moment as I was. Then we drove out of Daniel Boone National Forest back to the farm. Most people, I believe, would have probably, with a dog that was so severely injured, put him out of his misery and buried him. But we didn't. My mama did a lot of veterinarian work with our animals on the farm, and somehow, against all odds, she was able to doctor old Jake up and pretty much bring him back to life. From that moment on, old Jake and I had a special bond. We were always best friends, and he lived a long and happy life. I'll never forget what old Jake did for me that night in the Battle of the Backwoods. If a dog loves its human enough, they will battle something that is unbeatable to keep you safe from harm. I gave up on old Jake's life multiple times that terrible night, and he fought for me repeatedly. That was a difficult thing to live with, on top of the trauma I was not ready for at that time in my life. Moreover, if it weren't for the wisdom of my humble grandfather, then we would have lost old Jake forever. Both have now left this world, and have been called way up yonder to hunt in the hills of heaven, hopefully. You can say what you want to say about what terrifies you the most, but to me, it will always be the thing I saw. I guess you could say it was a dogman, werewolf, hellhound, skinwalker. I'm uncertain, but what I do know is it bled and felt pain just like any other animal in the world. And so I know what I saw was tangible and real. By the way, about a week later, someone found Bo at a local country store, so we were able to get him back as well. If you don't have anyone to lend you a helping hand in a dire situation, then I pray you will at least bring a paw to pull you out, as I did that October night. Rest in peace, Papaw Hank and old Jake. Your friend, Double A. Suffolk Skinwalker, from Jacob R. As of writing this happened about a month ago, right at the start of the urban archery season. My dad and I are avid hunters, hunting for both food and for the trophy of the hunt. We own about 38 acres out in Suffolk, Virginia. We've been hunting there for about 7 or 8 years now, but this has been the worst hunting trip of my life. My dad and I got out to the property at about 12:30 in the afternoon. We got our hunting gear on and parted our separate ways to our chosen ground blinds. I got into mine around 1 and got in and situated. As I sat there and waited, I decided to play Clash of Clans on my phone. Yeah, I know it's an old game, but it helps to pass the time. About an hour and a half into the hunting trip, I start to feel like I'm being watched, but I just passed it off as paranoia, so I go back to playing my game. After another half hour passes, I start to get bored. Deciding to take a nap, I slowly doze off and fall asleep for about an hour. When I woke up, I texted my dad to see how things were going on his end. Lo and behold, my phone doesn't have any service. At this point, the feeling of being watched returns twofold, and the forest has grown to be eerily silent. I see the reeds and branches moving from the slight breeze that's coming through, but I hear nothing. Then from my left, I hear my dad's voice say,
Jacob, Jacob, I need your help. Please come help me.
I look out of my ground blind, but I don't see him. I go back in, and by this point, the sounds of the forest have returned. So I go back to sleep for another hour or so. When I wake up for the second time, the sun has started to set, and I see this massive buck come out of the underbrush. I draw my crossbow and get ready to pull the trigger, making as little noise as possible. I start to hear what sounds like bones breaking, and the buck stands up on its hind legs. I look closer at it, and I see that its head is a skinless and meatless skull with rows of razor-sharp canine-like teeth. Before I know it, it no longer resembles a deer. It looks more like a malnourished person. Its skin is a light gray color, and it barely has any hair on its body. Its arms are so long they are barely touching the ground, and the figure is hunched over. Even in its current pose, it towers well over 7 feet tall. It opens its mouth and lets out the same phrase I heard earlier in my dad's voice.
Jacob, Jacob, I need your help. Please come help me.
But the voice is distorted from my dad's actual voice. Chills go down my spine and I start to tremble. The creature then puts its head in the air and starts to sniff. It lets out a low growl and says,
I can smell you. You're afraid.
I start to slowly unzip the ground blind. It quickly snaps its head towards me, letting out an ear-piercing screech. Then it chases me. I take off running to the truck, dropping my phone in the process. The forest is dead silent once again, and all that I can hear behind me is leaves crunching and twigs snapping as this creature inches closer and closer behind me. I'm almost to the truck when I trip on a root. I turn around with fear in my eyes and a cold sweat running down my face as this thing slows down to a walk and stumbles towards me. I'm cowering on the ground, and just at that point, I hear my dad's actual voice coming from behind me, telling me,
Jacob, run.
I do as I'm told, and all I hear behind me are the gunshots from my dad's pistol. About 2 minutes later, everything is quiet, and I see my dad running out of the woods towards me. We both hop in the truck and peel out of there. Since that day, we haven't gone into the property by ourselves. We always walk in together. Every now and then my dad and I still hear that screech way off in the distance, and we both shudder. My advice to you, don't go into the woodlands of Suffolk on your own if you value your life and your sanity. Warning: The following story contains depictions of a dead animal. My unforgettable hunting story. From John 897. I'm a 37-year-old male. At 6'7", I'm a pretty big guy, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about the time I almost died on a hunting trip. Let's begin. I was going to my hunting cabin in the woods with some pals of mine. About a quarter mile from my cabin on the gravel road I take to get there, I found a dead deer. But it was more than dead. It was mutilated. The body was in pieces, and the head was just gone. My hunting party and I got in my truck and floored it to the cabin. We were ready to get away from that thing and whatever might have done that to it. Later that night, we were out hunting as planned. At a certain point, we heard a stick snap about 30 feet behind us. Again, after seeing the dead deer earlier, we were spooked, so we headed back to the cabin. We fell asleep, but about an hour later, we all woke up to thudding on the walls of the cabin. We grabbed our rifles and went to check what made the sound. We expected to see a moose or bear, but what we saw out there, I could only describe as a wolf man. It stood at what had to have been around 8 feet tall. We were all horrified. It took a step towards us, and we just snapped out of our fear and began to fire at it. It screamed so loud, it brought all of us to our knees, but we kept shooting. Then it bolted into the forest and we ran to my truck. Once we started the truck, we didn't stop until we were back in the city we lived in. It was years before I went back to my hunting cabin. I haven't had anything like this happen to me since. However, I still wonder what would have happened if we didn't have our guns. What if we didn't go to hunt? What if we went for a different reason? A reason that didn't require guns?